In the depths of despair, behind cold prison walls, two souls who were never meant to meet again found themselves face to face. While the world outside celebrated love and freedom, one couple was about to discover how their forbidden reunion would spiral into something nobody could have predicted. But what dark truth lay hidden beneath their passionate history? And why did Elena choose this moment, after 7 years of silence, to step back into the life of the man society had condemned? The harsh fluorescent lights of the prison visitation room cast long shadows as Jacob sat waiting, his heart thundering against his rib. 7 years of incarceration had taught him to expect nothing, to hope for even less. But today was different. As the heavy door creaked open, revealing Elena's familiar silhouette, the air itself seemed to crackle with dangerous possibility. She stood frozen in the doorway, her professional attire a stark contrast to his prison jumpsuit, their eyes locked in a moment that defied time itself. Behind the observation window, young guard Marcus watched with growing unease. In his 3 years working here, he'd never felt tension quite like this. Above them all, Warden Beatrice's cold gaze narrowed, her clipboard gripped tight as she sensed the threat this reunion posed to her carefully controlled domain. "I never thought I'd see you again," Jacob whispered, his voice rough with emotion. The scruffy beard couldn't hide the man Elena had once known, the one who had promised her the world before everything shattered. She wanted to reach across the table to touch his hand, but the watchful eyes of the guards reminded her of the dangerous game they were playing. "Neither did I," Elena replied, her voice barely audible. "But some things," she paused, glancing nervously at the cameras mounted in every corner, "some things are stronger than prison walls." What they didn't know was that this reunion would trigger a chain of events that would expose corruption at the highest levels, challenge everything they thought they knew about loyalty, and force them to answer one devastating question. How much were they willing to sacrifice for a love that society had deemed forbidden? Stay with us as we uncover a heart-wrenching story of passion, betrayal, and the ultimate price of defying a system determined to keep them apart. Elena's hands trembled as she pulled out a worn envelope from her purse, sliding it carefully across the table. "Someone sent this to my office last week," she whispered, her eyes never leaving Jacob's face. "It's about what really happened that night." The color drained from Jacob's features as he stared at the envelope, his prison-hardened exterior cracking for just a moment. From his post, Marcus shifted uncomfortably, pretending to study his clipboard while straining to hear their hushed conversation. He'd read Jacob's file. 7 years for a crime that had always seemed too neat, too perfectly wrapped up. The young guard's conscience warred with his duty as he watched Elena lean closer, her voice dropping even lower. "Your caseworker reached out to me," Elena continued, her professional facade crumbling slightly. "Sarah, she found inconsistencies in the original investigation." Jacob's eyes darted to the observation window, where Warden Beatrice had disappeared from view. The mention of Sarah's name brought a fresh wave of guilt. His sister had never stopped fighting for him, even when he'd pushed everyone away. In her office, Warden Beatrice replayed the security footage from the previous week, her manicured nails tapping an irritated rhythm on her desk. The image showed Elena talking to Luis, Elena's father and a senior guard, in the parking lot. Their heated argument had caught her attention. Luis's traditional values and fierce disapproval of his daughter's past with Jacob were well known throughout the prison staff. "The evidence that put you here," Elena's voice cracked slightly, "it wasn't what we thought. Someone wanted you behind these walls, and I think I know why." She glanced at her watch. 5 minutes left in their allocated visitation time. "But we have to be careful. The same people who framed you 7 years ago, they're still watching." 7 years of bottled rage and injustice threatened to explode. But Elena's presence anchored him. He studied her face, noting the new lines of worry around her eyes, the determination set in her jaw. She had risked everything by coming here, by digging into a past that powerful people wanted buried. "Time's up," Marcus called out, his voice carrying a note of genuine regret. As Elena stood to leave, Jacob caught a glimpse of something else falling from her purse, a small newspaper clipping about local corruption in the prison system. Marcus saw it too, quickly stepping forward to retrieve it before the cameras could catch clear footage of the exchange. In the corridor outside, Luis emerged from the shadows, his weathered face a mask of disappointment as he watched his daughter hurry past. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mia," he called after her. Elena paused but didn't turn around, her shoulders straightening with resolve. "Sometimes the most dangerous thing," she replied, "is staying silent when you know the truth." Up in her office, Warden Beatrice made a phone call, her voice clipped and professional. "She came to see him. Yes, exactly as we predicted. No, they didn't have enough time to." "Wait," she froze, noticing something on one of her monitors. "Watching. We may have a complication." That night, the prison's atmosphere grew heavier with unspoken tensions. Marcus sat in the break room, the newspaper clipping burning a hole in his pocket as he pretended to focus on his coffee. The article detailed suspicious deaths at 3 different state prisons, all linked to a private security contractor, the same company Warden Beatrice had brought in 6 years ago. Down in his cell, Jacob lay on his narrow bunk, Elena's words echoing in his mind. The memory of her perfume lingered, a ghost of jasmine in the stale prison air. 7 years ago, he'd taken the fall for a crime he didn't commit, believing it would keep her safe. Now, the truth she carried threatened to shatter the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart. "Your girl's playing with fire," his cellmate whispered from the top bunk. "Heard the guards talking. Her daddy's real worked up about it." Jacob remained silent, but his mind raced. Luis had always opposed their relationship, even before the arrest. But there had been something else in the old guard's eyes today. Not just disapproval, but fear. Miles away, Elena sat in her dimly lit apartment, surrounded by case files and newspaper clippings. Sarah, Jacob's sister, had been right. The patterns were impossible to ignore once you started looking. Her hands shook as she dialed Sarah's number, praying she wasn't too late. "They're watching my house," Sarah answered without preamble, her voice tight with anxiety. "Ever since I accessed those old case files, Elena, what we've stumbled into, it's bigger than Jacob's wrongful conviction. The whole system is rotted from the inside out." In her office, Warden Beatrice reviewed Marcus's personnel file, her face illuminated by the blue glow of her computer screen. His record was impeccable, maybe too impeccable. Her phone buzzed with a text. "Handler compromised. Initiate contingency." Her lips tightened as she glanced at the security feed showing Marcus's current position. Some loose ends required immediate attention. The next morning, Elena arrived at her law office to find it had been ransacked. Her files were untouched, but her computer was missing. On her desk lay a single prison visitor's pass, not hers, but one belonging to another woman who had visited Jacob years ago. A woman whose death had been ruled a suicide 3 days after her visit. Marcus approached Jacob during yard time, carefully positioning himself away from the camera's direct view. "Your sister's evidence," he muttered, keeping his eyes forward. "It matches a case I've been building, but we need to move fast. Beatrice is cleaning house." Back in the visitation room, Louis stared at the chair where his daughter had sat yesterday. His weathered hands trembled as he pulled out an old photograph. Elena and Jacob at their high school graduation, young and in love, before the world had turned dark. His phone chimed with a message from Beatrice. "Meeting, 15 minutes. Bring the old files." He looked at the photo one last time before tucking it away. Sometimes, he realized, protecting your family meant making impossible choices. In her car, Elena discovered a hidden envelope tucked under her seat. Inside was a USB drive and a note in Sarah's handwriting. "If you're reading this, they've already moved against me. The truth about that night, it's all here, but be careful who you trust. Even the ones closest to us have prices they're willing to accept." She started her engine, unaware of the black SUV, pulling out 2 cars behind her, its tinted windows concealing faces that had been watching, waiting, for precisely this moment. The contents of Sarah's USB drive cast long shadows across Elena's laptop screen. Security footage from 7 years ago showed Jacob being led into an office. The timestamp matched perfectly with the moment the prosecution claimed he was elsewhere. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, only to find the line dead. Inside the prison, Marcus's morning rounds felt different. Fellow guards avoided his gaze, and whispered conversations died as he passed. In the staff room, his locker had been searched, subtle but noticeable to trained eyes. The newspaper clipping was safe, hidden in the one place they wouldn't look, sealed inside a Bible he'd given to Jacob during yesterday's yard time. "Your father asked for a transfer." Warden Beatrice's voice cut through Elena's thoughts during their unexpected meeting. Something about wanting to be closer to family. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Of course, given the current situation, I had to deny it. In his cell, Jacob ran his fingers over the newspaper, clipping hidden in the Bible's spine. The names jumped out at him. 3 dead witnesses, all connected to the private security firm. He remembered the night of his arrest, the mysterious man in the suit who'd offered him a choice. Now, 7 years later, the pieces were finally falling into place. Sarah's voice shook on Elena's answering machine. "I had to leave town. They found Maria's body, the woman from the visitor's log. She didn't commit suicide. There are photos, proof of what really happened. I've sent copies to every major news outlet, but..." The message cut off abruptly. Luis stood in the prison parking lot, staring at the old photograph of Elena and Jacob. His phone contained dozens of missed calls from his daughter, each one a knife in his heart. The weight of his service weapon felt heavier than usual as he made his way to Warden Beatrice's office. 25 years on the job, and he'd never questioned orders. Until now. "Your sister's very brave," Marcus told Jacob during dinner duty, his voice barely audible over the cafeteria noise. "But bravery got Maria killed. You need to tell Elena to back off before..." A crash interrupted them as another guard dropped his tray, creating a convenient distraction. By the time order was restored, Marcus had slipped Jacob a small piece of paper with a single word. "Tomorrow." Elena sat in her car outside the prison, Sarah's USB drive clutched in her hand. Tomorrow was her scheduled visit with Jacob, possibly her last chance to share what she'd discovered. The sound of approaching footsteps made her heart race, but it was only an old janitor, pushing his cart across the dark parking lot. She didn't notice the small tracking device he'd planted under her car, or the way he spoke quietly into his radio once he'd passed. In her office, Warden Beatrice reviewed the surveillance footage of Marcus and Jacob in the cafeteria. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text, "Board member arriving tomorrow. Clean house." She zoomed in on the Bible visible in Jacob's hands, her eyes narrowing at the slight bulge in its spine. 20 years of maintaining order had taught her to spot the smallest detail. Tomorrow would require careful handling, and perhaps a reminder of why some loves were better left forbidden. Dawn broke over the prison walls with an ominous silence. Elena's hands gripped her steering wheel as she passed through the first security checkpoint, the USB drive now hidden in a hollowed-out heel of her shoe. Each guard's face seemed to hold a secret. Every security camera felt like an accusing eye. But it was the sight of her father's empty guard post that sent the first real chill down her spine. Inside, Jacob paced his cell, the Bible clutched tight against his chest. Last night's dreams had been filled with memories. Elena's laugh at graduation, their first apartment's leaky faucet, the way she'd cried when they took him away. But now, another memory surfaced. The mysterious board member who'd visited him the night before his arrest, offering not a threat, but a promise. "Sometimes," the man had said, "love is the deadliest weapon we have." Marcus arrived for his shift early, his uniform pristine, his heart racing. The morning briefing room felt like a trap, ready to spring. Warden Beatrice stood at the front, her smile sharp as she announced the arrival of their distinguished visitor. "The board takes a special interest in facilities like ours," she said, her eyes finding Marcus in the crowd. "Especially when it comes to irregular activities." In the parking lot, Luis sat in his car, Sarah's latest message playing on his phone. "Dad." Recording cut off in static, but it was enough. His daughter had always been the brave one, just like her mother. He touched the photo on his dashboard one last time before reaching for his service weapon. Some debts could only be paid in full. Elena's heels clicked down the corridor toward the visitation room, each step bringing her closer to the truth. But when the door opened, it wasn't Jacob waiting for her. A well-dressed man sat at the table, his silver hair and expensive suit out of place in the drab surrounding. "Ness Rodriguez," he smiled. "I believe we have a mutual interest in discussing your father's retirement package." Upstairs, Warden Beatrice watched the security feeds, her fingers drumming in impatient rhythm. The board member's arrival wasn't a surprise, it was an opportunity. On her desk lay Marcus's complete file, including photos of him meeting with Sarah 3 weeks ago. Next to it, a single prison transfer order waited for her signature. Sometimes, loyalty needed to be tested before it could be destroyed. Jacob felt the change in the prison's atmosphere before he saw it. "Medical evaluation," the guard announced, but Jacob recognized the look in his eyes, the same look from the night of his arrest. As they led him down an unfamiliar corridor, he felt the Bible's weight against his chest, knowing its hidden evidence might be his last chance at exposing the truth. In the parking lot, Sarah's car pulled up to the security gate, her press badge ready. She dyed her hair, changed her clothes, but her determination remained unchanged. The thumb drive around her neck contained enough evidence to bring down not just the prison, but the entire network of corruption it represented. As she stepped out of her car, she didn't notice the red dot of a laser sight briefly dancing across her back. Marcus intercepted Jacob's escort. "Warden's orders," he said, flashing paperwork. "Prisoner needs to be taken to the East Wing." The other guard hesitated, and in that moment, Marcus saw the outline of a weapon that wasn't standard issue. Their eyes met, understanding passing between them like an electric current. The next few minutes would change everything. Elena stared at the silver-haired man, her foot pressing firmly against the hidden USB drive in her heel. "My father's retirement?" she repeated, buying time. Through the observation window, she caught a glimpse of movement, Jacob being led down a corridor that shouldn't exist, according to the prison blueprints she'd memorized. The man followed her gaze, his smile never wavering. "You know," he said softly, "the last person who sat in that chair asking questions about that corridor was Maria. Such a tragedy. What happened to her?" Marcus walked 2 steps behind, his presence both reassuring and terrifying. The guard with the non-standard weapon led the way, his shoulders tense with anticipation. Through the narrow windows, Jacob caught glimpses of an unmarked black van backing up to a service entrance. The same type of van he'd seen the night Maria died. In the visitation room, Elena's world narrowed to the silver-haired man's manicured hands as he slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos, Sarah at various locations, Louise meeting with journalists, Marcus passing something to Jacob in the yard. "Your father's retirement could be comfortable," the man said, "or it could be significantly more complicated, just like your dear friend Maria's departure was." Complicated? Warden Beatrice's office door burst open as Louis entered, his service and weapon steady in his hand. "Where's my daughter?" he demanded, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years of compromised morality. The warden merely smiled, gesturing to her security monitor, where Elena sat facing the board member. "Making a choice," Beatrice replied, "just like you did, all those years ago." Sarah had made it past 2 security checkpoints using her fake press credentials, but the third guard was different. His eyes lingered too long on her ID, his hand straying toward his radio. Behind her, she heard the distinctive sound of a vehicle's doors open. The thumb drive felt like it was burning against her skin as she made a decision that would change everything. "The corridor leads to the old administrative wing," Marcus whispered to Jacob as they walked. "They've been using it for special interrogations. Maria found out, and..." The guard ahead of them suddenly stopped, his hand going to his earpiece. Through the windows, Jacob saw more guards converging on the service entrance, their movements synchronized and practiced. Elena's heel pressed harder against the USB drive as she leaned forward. "Before we discuss my father's retirement," she said carefully, "I'd like to know more about the special interrogations in the old administrative wing." The silver-haired man's smile flickered for just a moment. But in that moment, Elena saw something that chilled her to her core. The same look she'd seen in security footage of Maria's last moments. Luis's hand never wavered as he kept his weapon trained on Beatrice. "I've protected your operation for years," he said, his voice thick with regret. "Helped you silence witnesses, falsified reports, all because you threatened my daughter. But Sarah found Maria's real autopsy report, and now, a sudden movement in the security feed caught his attention. Elena was standing up, backing away from the board member. In the corridor, everything happened at once. The guard's radio crackled with urgent commands. Marcus moved with unexpected speed, his Bible suddenly in Jacob's hands. The hidden evidence inside could expose everything. Through the windows, Jacob saw Sarah running across the parking lot, pursued by figures in tactical gear. And at the end of the corridor, a door opened to reveal Warden Beatrice, Louise's service weapon now in her hands. "Your choice is simple," the silver-haired man told Elena, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Walk away, now destroy the evidence your sister found, and everyone lives. Or, well, let's just say Maria made the wrong choice." Elena's hand found her shoe, feeling the USB drive's outline. 7 years of separation, of forbidden love and hidden truths had led to this moment. Through the observation window, her eyes met Jacob's across the distance. In that split second, everything else fell away. The conspiracy, the danger, the impossible choices. There was only the truth of their love and the price they were willing to pay to protect it. Elena's heel cracked against the floor as she stumbled backward, the USB drive falling free from its hiding place. The silver-haired man's eyes followed its arc through the air, but Elena was already moving, not toward the drive, but toward the door. Her father had taught her years ago, sometimes the best defense is to be unpredictable. In the corridor, chaos erupted. Marcus threw himself at the guard, their struggle sending both men crashing through a window. The Bible flew from Jacob's hands, papers scattering like autumn leaves. Warden Beatrice's shot went wide, the bullet embedding itself in the wall inches from Luis's head as he burst through the door behind her. Sarah heard the gunshot from the parking lot. The pursuing guards hesitated for a split second, just long enough. She reached her car, fingers fumbling with the keys, when she saw Elena running through the prison's side entrance. Their eyes met through the chain-link fence. Sarah's hand went to the thumb drive around her neck, understanding flowing between the sisters without word. "You've lost control of your facility," the silver-haired man said calmly into his phone as he watched Elena disappear through the door. "Initiate containment protocol." His composure cracked only slightly when he saw Luis's reflection in the observation window. Service weapon raised. "You were always a problem," Luis said, his voice heavy with decades of guilt. "I just didn't know how much until Maria died." Jacob scrambled for the scattered papers, knowing each one could mean life or death. Through the broken window, he could see Marcus struggling with the guard on the ground below. Warden Beatrice stood at the end of the corridor, her own weapon now trained on Jacob. 7 years, she said, almost sadly. 7 years of perfect order, perfect control, and she had to come back. In the parking lot, Elena ran toward Sarah's car as sirens began to wail. Prison guards emerged from every direction, but something was wrong. They weren't trying to stop her. They were running from something else, the containment protocol. She'd seen it mentioned in the files, a last resort, meant to eliminate all evidence and witnesses at once. Luis kept his weapon steady as the silver-haired man reached slowly into his jacket. The offshore accounts, the special interrogations, Maria's murder. "Did you really think we wouldn't figure it out?" The board member's smile returned, terrible in its confidence. "Figure what out? That we're turning prisons into private intelligence networks? That we're using inmates to gather information, eliminate threats? Or that your precious Elena was never the target?" Jacob was always the asset we wanted. Elena was just motivation. The realization hit Jacob like a physical blow as Warden Beatrice's words sank in. His arrest, his conviction, it had never been about silencing him. They'd wanted him inside the prison. Every cellmate he'd had over 7 years had been connected to someone powerful, someone with secrets, and he'd been listening, watching. They'd turned him into an unwitting spy, and Elena's periodic visits had been their way of ensuring his cooperation, even if he hadn't known it. Sarah's car engine roared to life as Elena reached the fence. Above them, alarm systems blared and security doors began to slam shut automatically. Through the chaos, Elena saw Jacob in the corridor window, their eyes meeting across the distance. Not for justice, not for truth, but for love. She turned away from Sarah's car, back toward the prison entrance. Behind her, Sarah understood. She pulled away, the thumb drive secure around her neck, carrying the evidence that could expose everything, while Elena ran back into danger, toward the man she'd never stopped loving. The silver-haired man's jacket finally opened, revealing not a weapon but a small remote detonator. Containment protocol isn't just about lockdown, he told Louise, his thumb hovering over the button. It's about ensuring nothing remains, no evidence, no witnesses, no loose ends. His smile widened as multiple small explosions began to rock the building's foundation. Welcome to retirement, old friend. The first explosion rocked the building's east wing, sending tremors through the concrete floor. Smoke began to fill the corridor as Jacob launched himself at Warden Beatrice, desperation lending him strength. They crashed together against the wall, her weapon clattering to the floor. Through the growing haze, he could see Elena running back into the building. His heart screamed in both joy and terror. She was coming back for him, but she was running straight into death. In the visitation room, Louis didn't hesitate. His bullet struck the detonator, sending it spinning from the silver-haired man's grasp. But the board member only laughed, blood seeping from his wounded hand. "Too late," he gasped. "Dead man's switch. The whole facility is already programmed to collapse, unless," his eyes gleamed with cruel triumph, "unless someone with the override code stops it. Someone like me." Elena fought her way through panicking guards and inmates as another explosion shook the building. The prison's automated systems were failing. Security doors slammed randomly, sprinklers activated in sporadic bursts. Through the chaos, she heard Marcus's voice. "This way." He was bleeding from the window fight but still standing, pointing toward a maintenance stairwell. Sarah's car screeched to a halt at the local news station. Inside, reporters gathered around her laptop as she plugged in the thumb drive. Footage of Maria's murder played across the screen, followed by financial records, emails, the entire conspiracy laid bare. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Elena went back in. "Hurry." She looked at the reporters, determination hardening her features. "We need to go live, now." Warden Beatrice's mask of control finally cracked as Jacob pinned her against the wall. This was bigger than prison, bigger than justice. We were building a network of information that could control everything. Every secret, every scandal, all of it flowing through our inmates to the highest bidders. Another explosion rocked the building, closer this time. "And you, Jacob, you were the perfect listener, so quiet, so observant. Everyone trusted you." "The override codes," he demanded. "Now." The board member's bloody smile widened. "On one condition, I walk away, and this all stays buried." A chunk of ceiling crashed behind them, emphasizing his point. "Or we all die here, and your daughter's brave return becomes her final act of love." Elena and Marcus reached the maintenance stairwell just as the power failed. Emergency lights cast eerie shadows as they climbed. Jacob figured it out months ago. Marcus explained between breaths. Started feeding them false information through their network, but he needed proof of the whole operation. They reached a heavy metal door. "The real evidence isn't in Sarah's drive. It's in that Bible. Every name, every secret they collected, and how they used it. That's why they activated containment. They know he's been playing them." Through the smoke and chaos, voice calling his name. Hope and fear warred in his chest as he kept Beatrice pinned. The warden's laugh turned into a cough as dust filled the air. "Save your love, but remember, we're not the only facility, not the only network. This system, this web of power and secrets, it's everywhere." His composure finally shattered. "Kill me or save them?" he snarled at Louise. "Choose." Through the observation window, Luis saw Elena and Marcus emerging from the stairwell, running toward Jacob's position. His daughter's face was streaked with soot, but determined. She'd chosen love over safety, truth over comfort. Now it was his turn to choose. The building groaned, support beams beginning to buckle. In the middle of it all, Elena finally reached Jacob. Their eyes met through the smoke, 7 years of separation dissolving in an instant. She grabbed his hand, feeling the strength that had never wavered, the love that had never died. Behind them, Luis appeared, dragging the silver-haired man at gunpoint. "The override codes," Elena's father growled. "Give them to my daughter, now." Around them, the walls began to crack as their time ran out, and with it, their chance to expose a conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives in the name of power. Time seemed to freeze in the smoke-filled corridor as the silver-haired man's fingers moved across Elena's phone, inputting the override codes. Each keystroke felt like an eternity as chunks of ceiling continued to fall around them. Jacob held Elena close, his heart pounding against hers, both knowing these might be their last moments together. Through the chaos, Warden Beatrice watched with defeated rage as her carefully constructed empire crumbled. "It's done," the board member said, his usual smoothness replaced by desperate resignation. On the phone's screen, red warning signals turned green as the containment protocol began to deactivate. But they weren't safe yet. The damage already done to the building's structure groaned ominously above them. "Move!" Marcus shouted, pushing them toward the exit as another support beam gave way. Elena stumbled, her hand clutching the Bible containing Jacob's collected evidence. Behind them, Warden Beatrice made a final, desperate lunge for freedom, only to be caught by Luis. "This is for Maria," he said, securing handcuffs around her wrists even as the walls shook. Outside, Sarah's evidence was spreading like wildfire across every major news network. Camera crews surrounded the prison as inmates and guards evacuated. The sight of the silver-haired board member in custody, led out by Luis, caused a frenzy of flashing cameras and shouted questions. But Elena and Jacob barely noticed. Their world narrowed to each other as they emerged into the sunlight. 7 years, Elena whispered, touching Jacob's face with trembling fingers. 7 years of secrets and lies, all to protect me. Jacob caught her hand, pressing it to his heart. "And I'd do it again, but this time we exposed the truth together." Around them, FBI vehicles began arriving, agents moving quickly to secure the scene and the high-profile prisoners. Marcus approached them, his uniform dusty, but his smile genuine. "The evidence in that Bible," he said, nodding to the book Elena still clutched, combined with Sarah's files. "It's not just about this prison, it's about the entire network. Politicians, judges, corporate leaders, everyone who used this system to gather and trade secrets." He paused as Sarah's car pulled up, her face glowing with triumph. "It's over, really over." But it was too late. The truth had been set free, and like a wildfire, it couldn't be contained. Through the window, he saw Elena and Jacob embrace, their love having survived everything he'd thrown at them. Perhaps that was his greatest miscalculation, believing that power could overcome the strength of the human heart. Luis stood with his daughters, watching as Jacob gave his official statement to the FBI. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with years of regret. "I thought I was protecting you by playing their game. Instead, I almost lost everything that really mattered." Elena squeezed his hand, understanding in her eyes. "You made the right choice in the end, Dad. That's what counts." Warden Beatrice and her conspirators were led away one by one, their web of influence unraveling with each new revelation. But for Elena and Jacob, the chaos faded into the background. They stood together in the prison yard where their reunion had begun, now free to look toward a future they never thought they'd have. "What happens now?" Elena asked, her head resting on Jacob's shoulder, as the sun began to set. He smiled, watching as cleanup crews and investigators swarmed the partially damaged building. Now we build something new, something true." He turned to face her fully, his eyes filled with 7 years of unspoken love. No more forbidden feelings, no more hidden truths, just us facing whatever comes next together. 6 months later, the old prison stood empty, its dark secrets finally exposed to the light. The congressional hearings had lasted weeks, each revelation sending shockwaves through corridors of power. 43 high-ranking officials had been indicted, 17 private prisons had been shut down, and thousands of cases were under review. But on this bright autumn morning, Elena wasn't thinking about any of that. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting her suit one last time. Today was Jacob's final testimony, the last piece in dismantling the network they'd helped expose. Her fingers traced the small scar on her heel, a reminder of the USB drive that had changed everything. Behind her, Sarah appeared in the doorway, holding up a newspaper. The headline read, "Prison Intelligence Network Scandal." The past months had transformed them all. Luis had become a key witness, his testimony helping to free dozens of wrongfully convicted inmates. Marcus had been promoted to lead a new prison reform initiative, his experiences helping to reshape the system from within. And Elena had finally found her true purpose, turning her law practice into a beacon for justice reform. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters as Jacob emerged from the witness chamber. His testimony had taken hours, but his voice never wavered as he detailed how he'd gathered evidence, slowly building a case while appearing to be their perfect informant. The silver-haired man and his conspirators watched from the defendant's box as their empire of secrets crumbled under the weight of truth. Warden Beatrice had already pleaded guilty, her confession opening floodgates of information about similar operations across the country. But her last words to Elena had been unexpected. "I was wrong about one thing. I thought love made people weak, made them controllable. But your love brought down an empire." As Jacob descended the courthouse steps, Elena took his hand. The simple gold band on his finger caught the sunlight, a mirror of the one she wore. They'd married 3 months ago, a small ceremony attended by those who'd stood with them through everything. Luis had walked Elena down the aisle, his eyes bright with tears of joy rather than regret. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Jacob said as they walked through the plaza where protesters once demanded his freedom. "That first moment I saw you again in the prison visiting room. Even after 7 years, even through all their schemes and manipulations, our love was still stronger than their power." Elena smiled, remembering the electricity of that reunion, the fear and hope that had sparked everything that followed. "They never understood," she replied. "That love isn't a weakness to exploit. It's a strength that can move mountains or tear down prison walls." Behind them, Sarah was already working on her next investigation. Marcus was implementing reforms would prevent such abuses from happening again, and Louise was finding redemption by helping others seek justice. But for Elena and Jacob, the future stretched out before them like an open road, no longer forbidden, no longer hidden. As they reached their car, Jacob pulled Elena close, their foreheads touching in a moment of quiet intimacy. Around them, the world continued to change. Policies were being rewritten, systems reformed, lives rebuilt. But in this moment, they were simply two souls who had defied an empire for love, who had turned their forbidden reunion into a force for justice. "Ready to go home?" Elena asked, her voice soft with promise. Jacob smiled, the last shadows of his imprisonment long faded from his eyes. "Oh," he repeated, the word carrying the weight of everything they'd fought for, everything they'd won. "With you, I'm always home." Their story would be told for years to come, the tale of forbidden love that exposed corruption, of truth that overcame power, of hearts that refused to be imprisoned. But for Elena and Jacob, the greatest victory wasn't in the scandals they'd exposed or the systems they'd changed. It was in the simple freedom to love openly, honestly, completely. In the end, that was worth every risk, every sacrifice, every moment of their extraordinary journey. As they drove away from the courthouse, the setting sun painted the sky in colors of hope. Their love, once hidden behind prison walls, had become a beacon of light, proving that even in the darkest places, the human heart could not be contained. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful truth of all.